Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here with a very highly requested video, and I think it's about time to go ahead and do it, seeing as the day is coming, according to CA. So a lot of people have been asking, hey Sotek, what are your thoughts on what kind of units or regiment of renowns or whatever we'll be seeing for the upcoming Lizardmen vs. Skaven DLC? And I certainly have a lot of opinions. So, one of the things I did today was that I sat down and kind of just typed out an overview of all the things I would like to see and all the things I'm expecting or hoping for. And I thought I would just go ahead and tell you guys what I'm looking forward to, what I'm hoping to see. That way you can kind of take a look at those things and I can explain them out and you can have an idea about what my wish list is. I do want to go ahead and say that I tend to be someone that shoots for the stars and expects to land somewhere a little short, you know? So some of the things that are on my wish list, I'm trying to keep it reasonable, you know, looking at what we saw with the Queen and the Crone and trying to aim somewhere in that ballpark, even though I desperately hope that for this DLC they focus more on giving us more units and less on making like one-off campaign mechanics that we will only see for the DLC faction. Because don't get me wrong, Alarielle and Hellebrand have a lot of cool things, but I'm not a huge fan of the fact that a significant portion of their DLC is only available when you play their faction, which just kind of is like, it's not that great. You know, Alarielle and Hellebrand, Hellebrand's got her whole Death Knight thing, and Alarielle's got all of her Everqueen stuff, and it's cool, but it's like you can only play their campaign so many times, which, yeah, I don't know. I kind of prefer when DLCs bring more for the units and for the faction and as a general upgrade, as opposed to just lasering in on those DLC characters. Like, I enjoyed Skarsnik and Belegar because they provided a different campaign in that both of them are easily the hardest of their respective races due to a completely different dynamic they have racing for 8 peaks. So it's enough to make their campaigns exciting and difficult and different, but it wasn't so laser focused that you felt like you were wasting time playing the non-DLC characters, which sometimes is kind of how I feel about Queen and the Crone. So with that out of the way, let me go ahead and talk about what I would like to see in this DLC. And we're just going to go down the list. So let's go ahead and get started. So in case it wasn't clear from the thumbnail and the title of the video, today I'm only going to be focusing on the Lizardmen side of things, because I don't want to lecture on for 1,000 years. So let's go ahead and start with the Legendary Lord. I feel 100% certain that the Legendary Lord for the Lizardmen is going to be Tehenhauin, the Prophet of Sotek. Now, the reason I feel that way is for a couple reasons. One, we already have a Slann Legendary Lord and a Saurus Legendary Lord. The one thing we're missing now is a Skink Legendary Lord, because those are the 3 main types of Lizardmen. Technically, we could get a Kroxigor Legendary Lord, hopefully at some point, with Nakai the Wanderer, but that's something we'll talk about later on in the free LC section, as he's sort of an option there. But let's focus on Tehenhauin. So what can we expect from the Prophet of Sotek, who, if you can't tell, is my favorite character by a long shot? So he has a couple of really cool things. First thing to know about him is that he is a melee caster hybrid. So he is a very, very combat focused character with pretty solid defense, really powerful offense, and he's a extremely powerful wizard. In tabletop, he was known as a level 3 wizard, which is basically the highest you could be without being the max tier, because max tier was level 4 with some very, very minor exceptions. But those were like Lord level casters. Like Archaon in 8th edition was only a level 2 caster, I think. He was either level 2 or level 1. But most lords start off at level 3 and then you could pay extra to get them to level 4, but Tehenhauin was a level 3, which was way above where most skinks could be. He uses the lore of beasts, which is a really solid lore. It's a really good lore on Durthu, and right now in multiplayer it's very popular due to the Manticore summons, and Flock of Doom is always super good, and it has some really nice buff spells, even though those don't get used as often, even though I very, very much like them. But I would not be surprised to see Tehenhauin as a wizard get kind of a unique spin on his. Kind of like how we see the Von Karstein Lord get a Vargulf for their transformation of Caden. I would not be surprised to see Tehenhauin get a dinosaur summon instead. Maybe like a Bastillodon or a Stegodon. I can't see a Carnosaur. That seems a little bit too strong. A Troglodon could be really good if a Troglodon is in this DLC because it would fit thematically and be a powerful summon. We'll talk about the Troglodon later. But, so with Tehenhauin, you got the Lore of Beasts. Really solid lore. He's a pretty gifted caster. He's not super focused into casting, but he's better at it than most. So he'll be pretty efficient at it. You won't have to worry. He won't be one of those casters that like doesn't have Arcane Conduit, for instance. The other things that are important to note about him is that he is an ambush-focused style fighter. So I imagine in campaign he will have a massive bonus to using ambush stance and catching enemies unaware, in addition to having increased ambush defense chance. He is supposed to be completely immune to all poison. He's actually one of the only characters in tabletop who could just negate poison no matter what the source was. I don't know if that's possible to implement in the current system. For instance, like if a poison attack were to hit his model, I don't know if there would be a way for the game to say, okay, this model just ignores poison. But if that's possible, then he should definitely have that ability, which of course would make him exceedingly strong. I mean, that would be a colossal buff and would really help him duel significantly against characters who tend to rely on that and are really nasty because of it, like Morgar, for instance. Other things that are notable about him that are fun to talk about, he obviously has poison attacks thanks to his Blade of the Serpent's Tongue, which is his magic weapon. It also makes him very, very nasty on the charge, so he potentially could just have an increased charge bonus, or maybe the Blade of the Serpent's Tongue would be an active weapon that would give him some kind of buff when charging. I hope he has poison all the time, because being the prophet of the serpent god, it would be very bizarre for him not to always have his poison active. You know, I'm hoping he's not like some characters we've seen, like, you know, Ungrim or Grimgor, or, you know, who's a good example is Kazrak. Kazrak has his Whip Scourge, which gives him poison attacks, but only when it's active. I hope that's not what they do with Tehenhauin. It makes sense for some characters, but Tehenhauin poison is such an integral part of his character design that it really feels like it's one of those things that should be active at all time and just be a part of his character. Another thing that he has then is the Plaque of Sotek, which in tabletop just gave him a flat ward save. I'd be very surprised to see that be an item he can take in multiplayer, as it's probably going to be a campaign-only item that just provides him with like a ward save and a couple of other campaign bonuses. I don't see it being, like, I could see it raising like Untainted in your area, maybe increasing post-battle loot, and maybe public order faction-wide. You know, not one of those items that can really easily have an active component, so it seems unlikely that we'll see it have something you would expect in multiplayer. Other things that he does that are super awesome is he has this thing called the Tide of Serpents, which I don't know if that's going to be easy for them to do, but basically when Tehenhauin's on foot, he basically travels with this swarm of snakes constantly around him. And the thing about it is it makes him pretty dangerous, because it basically just gives him a bunch of additional attacks that are just poison for eternity. So I guess that could be where he would get his original poison from, but I could just see that basically being a way for them to grant him perma poison, if maybe not also increase his like melee defense or melee attack to represent just this tide of little snakes. Or it could even be an explosion ability, kind of like we see with Krokgar or Khalida or the Skaven Lords, where they, you know, have that big boom and it lets them run off. I could see Tehenhauin's Master of Serpents or Tide of Serpents ability give him some kind of explosion that has like a bunch of snakes come out everywhere and like start feasting on people, which could be pretty awesome. And the last thing he has, which won't be an active ability more than likely, but it'll probably be something in single player. And his skill tree is an ability he has called Master of Snakes, which basically just gives him a bunch of buffs. Tabletop, it allowed him to join swarms, which were like you could have entire swarms of units, like bat swarms and jungle swarms and tomb swarms and snotling swarms, and there were tons of them. But for the Lizardmen, they had jungle swarms, which were a bunch of poisonous insects and lizards and snakes. And Tehenhauin could join them, and if he did, he would not only become unbreakable himself, but he would make the swarms unbreakable and immune to an ability called Squishing, which was basically that swarms were basically meat shields. They were units that would run out, and they were technically unbreakable, but if they started losing combat, they acted just like undead do, where they would start crumbling. Well, if Tehenhauin joined up a unit of them, he would make them immune to crumbling. So he made swarms into true unbreakable units, which was a pretty terrifying ability. Honestly, I would just see that being in his, like, you know, once you reach level 12, you have access to your Lord's unique skills tree. If Master of Snakes was in, I could see that being like one of his max tier abilities in single player that just made him unbreakable. But that's pretty much Tehenhauin in a nutshell. He's a very, very skilled combatant. He is the fastest Lizardman character by far. Well, I guess Tic-Tac-Toe is faster movement-wise because he flies. But Tehenhauin, as far as like battle speed goes, he is really fast for a Lizardman, which you would expect, you know, from a Skink character. So, Gifted Wizard has really powerful melee abilities, is a poisonous character, has pretty solid defenses, hits surprisingly hard, you know, because you think, oh, a Skink, he shouldn't hit that hard. He actually hits really hard. And for mounts, he can either show up on foot, or he can show up on an Ancient Stegodon. Traditionally, the Ancient Stegodon that he shows up with always has an Engine of the Gods, which we'll talk about later on in this video. But I could see for him, he could just have a regular Ancient Stegodon, and then you could upgrade it to an Engine of the Gods version, or you could just have him go straight to the Engine of the Gods. But that's Tehenhauin in a nutshell. Especially with his Stegodon, I could see him being a very popular option, especially if he gets a really big charge bonus from using the Blade of the Serpent's Tongue. We'll have to see. But in any event, I am very, very excited to see him. I feel super confident that he's the DLC character. I'm not even going to entertain the idea that he's not, because I refuse to believe that it's possible. We'll be talking about some other lords after we get through all the DLC info, because that's where I'm going to put the free LC stuff. But for now, we can wrap up Tehenhauin, you know, so hopefully that answers everything you want to know. A character who's probably going to have a lot of bonuses against Skaven, probably recruitment reduction and upkeep reduction for like all types of Skink units. Probably is going to be, you know, a really powerful caster, a really good melee fighter, lots and lots and lots of poison, and hopefully an immunity to poison, which would honestly probably be one of the cooler effects. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to Lords. So when looking at generic Lords, I really feel like there's only two possible options we can look at here for a DLC. And the reason I say that is I don't think we're going to get any heroes like we saw with the Queen and the Crone, because they had, you know, like the Handmaiden, who's not a Lord but a hero. But I don't think we're going to see that with the Lizardmen, because we already have heroes covered. We got a Saurus Scarvet, we got Skink Chief, and we got Skink Priest. And the Skink Chief can even be customized as a Chameleon Skink version, or as kind of like a mounted version, depending on what upgrades you give them in campaign. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to me that they would just give us another hero, because what would they do? Now, with Lords, there's a little bit of variance. The first one, which I think is the much more likely option, is new versions of the Slann Mage Priest. So, right now, we only have 3 Slann, generic Slanns. We have the Lore of Heaven Slann, the Lore of High Magic Slann, and the Lore of Light Slann, which are all cool, but those are only 3 lores of magic, and we should definitely have a lot more than that for the Slann, who, you know, are the apex casters in Warhammer Fantasy, only rivaled by the Greater Demons of Tzeentch. So I really hope that the lords we're getting, and I think the lords we're getting, are just more Slann, especially because you may not know this, but we actually don't have the classic original Slann color right now. The OG Slann, the one that comes to mind if you ever talk to someone who plays tabletop or is familiar with the lore, and you say Slann Mage Priest, the color that's going to pop into their head is green. Green Slann are like the Slann color. And in Total War Warhammer, we've got blue, orange, and yellow, which, what? Like, where's my actual Slann? Where's my original baby boy? Give me my green boy. So I really, really hope we're going to get like 3 or 4 new Slann. If I had to pick, we're missing 6 lores for the Slann right now. If I had to pick like 3 under pain of death, and I was only allowed to have those 3, I would choose the Life Slann for the classic green Slann. A, because that would look good and would give me my sweet green boy. And B, especially because Cold-Blooded no longer provides healing, I don't think a Life Slann would be that overpowered. Because the only other way to get healing in the Lizardmen roster is through the Revivification Crystal, which is a powerful creature, and it would combo very nicely with a Lore of Life Slann, but that would still be a ton of investment into a really healing-focused build, which could be countered by someone who just like quickly takes out a Bastiladon. Because even if you have a Slann running around out there and like he only has regrowth and Earthblood, for instance, and then you have a Rev Crystal, that's a lot of resources pooled into just trying to keep up healing, and it's 2 very easily focused down targets if you're not the best at microplay. It might take a little bit of balance to get the Rev Crystal to where it would not be super OP in like a multiplayer format if you also had a Lore of Life Slann on the field. But, I mean, quite frankly, when you saw Lizardmen in Tabletop in 8th edition and quite frankly 7th edition, the most popular Lore of Magic for Lizardmen was the Lore of Life, because it just synergized really, really well, and it was just a very classic lore you would see with Lizardmen all the time. So that's my biggest one. For my other 2 options, I think the lores that would synergize well with Lizardmen without making them completely broken, if I had to just pick 2, I would probably pick the Lore of Shadow and the Lore of Metal, because I think that would give some really interesting variety to the Lizardmen, especially a lot of the buff spells and debuff spells that those would provide. You know, especially like with the Lore of Metal bringing in being able to increase armor and other things like that. Obviously, Final Transmutation is a super dangerous spell, but most lores have one spell that's super ugly. The other spells, for anyone that's curious, that are missing from Slann are the Lore of Fire, the Lore of Death, which would of course make Lizardmen very competitive, and the Lore of Beasts. Beasts I don't think we're going to need, honestly, because Skink Priests already have access to Beasts, and with Tehenhauin coming in, we're going to have a Lord level Beast caster. So I would probably just do Life, Shadow, and Metal. If they wanted to do Fire and or Death, that'd be great too. But those are the Slann we're missing. So those are what I'm the most hoping for. So now let's talk about the more outlandish option for a potential Lord who would be a little bit trickier to implement. The only other possible generic character I could see, which would almost have to be a Lord, because otherwise it would overlap too much with the Skink Priest, is the Skink Oracle. I'm not going to talk a ton about him right now, because I don't think he's a realistic chance, and I would rather focus on the Troglodyte later on, which have the Skink Oracles as mounts. So the first thing I want to say is that for the Skink Oracle to be in the game, I think we would have to have the Troglodyte. And unfortunately, I have personally put the Troglodyte in my not very likely section for right now, just because the way the DLCs have been kind of shaping up lately. But that being said, I'm totally open to be wrong, but I just don't see the Oracle as being super likely, because it kind of has almost a hero-like position. It's more of a close combat focused Skink Priest, and they're these twin-tailed skinks that ride troglodytes, who are these super scary blind dinosaurs who also have split tails, which, you know, looks like a serpent's tongue because the whole Sotek thing. And the thing that Skink Oracles do is they have 2 main functions, which is A, that they're the only Lizardmen capable of mastering a troglodyte. So that's kind of their big thing, is that they're able to get them under control and ride them into battle, which are super dangerous predator beasts. And B, that they kind of act as eyes and ears for the Slann. So in Tabletop, they have the Arcane Vassal ability, which in Warhammer, Total War Warhammer, has been interpreted basically as they have a free cast of Fireball. So it would basically be a non-wizard who has the ability to shoot fireballs as a bound spell. which I imagine they would have access to early on, rather, because the Skink priests have that ability right now, but I think they have to be like level 18 or something pretty high to have access to it in single player, and they definitely don't have access to it in multiplayer. The Skink Oracle, I would expect his Arcane Vassal to be like available from the get-go and be like a core part of his kit. The other thing that they do is they essentially have this rod that allows them to channel the winds of magic. Kind of like a wizard. They essentially have arcane conduit built into them, despite the fact that they're not wizards, which is a pretty nifty ability. That would actually be a pretty cool thing to see on a lord. It's called a divining rod, essentially, which would, if I had to design the rule for it, I would say it'd be kind of a cool thing to see it as just a ability for him to. It would either be a passive, like just recharges your winds of magic faster, or maybe if he's on the field, he increases your power reserve, or maybe he just has arcane conduit. You know, a skink melee character who kind of runs around and would provide some interesting buffs, including recharging winds of magic for your skink priest and all this other stuff. But even as I say it out loud, it just doesn't sound like a good lord choice. I mean, I'll put it this way. If CA wants to make the Skink Oracle a lord, I don't think that would be a bad thing, because I'm sure people like myself would be really interested in trying to make all skink armies work. But he's one of those characters that CA would have to drastically change from his original inception in 8th edition to make functional. Because right now it's literally just like a unit champion, almost. Like, that's the most generous way I can describe a Skink Oracle. It's not a character. You know, it's a rider on a dinosaur that makes the dinosaur a little bit more interesting. But that's really it. So I don't see the Skink Oracle being a lord. They would have to do a ton of stuff to make him more viable. Like, he'd probably need to be made into a full-on wizard. He would probably need to have poisoned attacks. He would need to have the Troglodyte as a very quick access mount. They would have to really vamp up his abilities to make him competitive as a lord despite being a skink. Because if he, being a skink, he'd probably have very low armor, fairly low melee defense and melee attack. So he'd be pretty vulnerable to being sniped. So he wouldn't have a very large health pool. So I don't know what they could do to make him that competitive unless he was just like super cheap. But cheapness doesn't really work for lords as well. Just because, if your lord dies, it does such a dramatic impact on your army. So I feel pretty confident with saying that the Slann are hopefully the thing that are going to get the update from the character slot. The Skink Oracle, I just don't see it. So feel like I can close my book on that, and let's go ahead and hop into units. I'm going to do my best here to kind of blitz through these to an extent. Like, I'm going to give you a brief description, but I have the unit section broke up into 2 tables, which I have my units that seem very, very likely table, and I have my units that don't seem very likely table. And we're going to start with the very likely ones and kind of work our way down. So the first unit that I want to start with is the Ripperdactyls. So Ripperdactyls, if you're not familiar with them, I have a couple of pictures here up on screen. They're basically flying piranhas that are the size of pterodons, and they are hilarious and also terrifying. They are these very, very heavy armor-piercing units that are very, very swift because, they're fast flyers. They have skinks on their backs who are more designed for combat, so they wear heavier armor, they have shields, and they don't have any ranged weapons. They're literally just there to kill stuff. And it's a unit that basically is designed to dive in and just annihilate something. They, in tabletop, very much specialized in wiping out man-sized or cav-sized units that had very high armor due to super high armor piercing, a lot of attacks, and of course, having Killing Blow. Now, Killing Blow in Total War Warhammer has traditionally been represented with an anti-infantry bonus, but personally, I would rather not see that on the Ripperdactyls. I would rather them just have very, very high armor piercing ratios that allow them to take out heavy cav and heavily armored infantry. They weren't a unit that you would fly down into, demigriffs. Demigriffs would, wail on them. But, Empire Knights or Reichsguard, You just fly above them, wait for the proper moment, swoop down on their flank, and literally just one-shot the entire unit. And it was beautiful. So their kind of skill sheet is they cause fear, they have frenzy, they have super high armor piercing, they have killing blow, which could be interpreted as an anti-infantry or anti-large, but like I said earlier, I hope they just kind of focus on making it pure, like just really high AP. Because not all units that have had killing blow have also gotten anti-infantry. It's been kind of not super evenly applied. For instance, Tomb Guard have, like, that's what they do in tabletop, is Grave Guard and Tomb Guard from the Tomb Kings and Vampire Counts were both units that had a built-in killing blow rule, and both of them could get really good at it. But in Total War Warhammer, only the Grave Guard have anti-infantry. The Tomb Guard don't, which I always found a little weird. But, you know, it is what it is. In any event, so Ripperdactyls, really hope to see him as just high armor piercing, very fast, frenzy, fear, and fairly high armor, especially for Skinks. They're shielded, so they're resistant to missile fire, which is good on flying units. And the final thing for them is that they have this unique ability called Toad Rage. And the way this basically works is that in tabletop, Skink scouts would always sneak into the enemy army before a battle and plant what they're called bloat toads on an enemy unit. And they're basically these large amphibian toads that the mere smell of them causes Ripperdactyls to go into like this god-awful rage, because bloat toads are natural predators of Ripperdactyl nests, so they would like show up and eat their eggs. So the Ripperdactyls evolved to develop this hatred for bloat toads, and they go into this terrible frenzy where they just kill everything around them, which seems like overkill, but you know, what are you going to do when you're a flying piranha? And so the way it works in tabletop is you would plant a bloat toad on a unit, and if your Ripperdactyls charge that unit, they would get a massive buff to their frenzy. So the way I would see that working in Total War Warhammer is a one use per battle ability that would either be a buff on them or a debuff on a chosen unit that would allow them to just go into ultra kill mode. So just imagine you're flying your Ripperdactyls around, your enemy charges like a unit of Reiksguard into some chameleon skinks, and while they're sitting there kind of busy fighting and unprepared and getting poisoned by the chameleon skinks, you activate your Toad Rage, and maybe it makes your unit rampage, so you lose control of them, but it gives them like a massive bonus to their melee attack and their armor piercing or weapon damage. Wouldn't that be awesome? Like, I'd love to have a Lizardman unit that you're like, activate rampage, and they just go apeshit and start just wrecking everybody. Kind of like we see with the Cauldron of Blood, but being a self-target buff exclusive to that unit, which I think is what Witchbrew does for the Cauldron of Blood / Death Hag, but you get the point. So those are Ripperdactyls. I think they are the most needed unit for the Lizardman roster, because right now the Lizardmen really struggle with dealing with fast, heavily armored targets like knights, because the Lizardmen don't have anything that's that fast. Even their dinosaurs are a little bit lumbering, and they don't have any missile attacks that are good for dealing with lots of knight units. You know, if you're fighting against High Elves or Empire, and they're running like 3-4 units of knights, whether it's Silverhelms, Empire Knights, Reiksguard, or Dragon Princes, as Lizardmen, it is super hard to deal with that unless you have like really well-timed magic, or you get lucky with a Carnosaur charge. But like, your only option right now really is to try and counter it with Coldblood Spear Riders, which is, it's just a really pigeonhole thing that Lizardman builds have to deal with. I have seen lately people have been kind of figuring out new ways to deal with it, like the Feral Carnosaur and stuff like that, but it'd be so nice to be able to go on the aggressive with a flying hardcore melee unit that, you know, Ripperdactyls would almost certainly get torn apart by like Pegasus Knights, you know, like have anti-large and are much more skilled, but don't have as hardcore aggression. You know, I'd kind of like to see them as somewhere between like Pegasus Knights and Vargheists, though I honestly think they'll be better than both of those, just due to having really high AP but having shields and a little bit of armor, which kind of is, you know, the problem with Pegasus Knights a lot of the times they don't have a ton of AP, and the problem with Vargheist tends to be that they are just the squishiest squishy in the universe, with like no defense and no regen or nothing, so they tend to just get like obliterated by shooting. So yeah, that's the unit I'm the most excited for, but I've got a couple more on my expected list, so let's keep moving. Next up on the docket is one of the original Lizardmen, the Salamanders. So back when Games Workshop first released the Lizardmen, and thank God they did because it made them my favorite fantasy universe, Salamanders were kind of the original monstrous beasts that the Lizardmen had available, and were one of our opening artillery pieces. The other, of course, being the Stegodon, which had a giant bow in its original version. So the Salamanders are these large, fast-moving critters, and they usually travel in groups of 3 on tabletop, which means for Total War, I can imagine there's probably going to be like somewhere between 5 to 10 of them, maybe in a unit. But they're basically these fairly large beasts, so like think the size of a demigriff, give or take, that run around, and they're aquatic, they're swift, and they're as fast as skinks, so they're very, very quick. They're not like slow lumbering critters. And they vomit this really nasty acid that they kind of store it in their, they store it in these big glands underneath their faces. And they vomit out this acid that the moment it makes contact with the air, it bursts into flame. And kind of some cool lore things about them is the reason that salamanders have all those fins all over their body, like they have fins coming off their heads and off their backs and stuff, is because they use those to basically fan out and cool themselves off whenever they're breathing acid, because it causes their bodies to heat up. And obviously they're cold-blooded, so you don't want to heat them up too much. But when agitated, they shoot out this corrosive acid that ignites when it makes contact with the air, or oxygen, and it's basically napalm. Like, it's not like some flamethrowers where, you ignite a gas and it just shoots out really hot air and can burn you or set you on fire. No, this is like a sticky, nasty substance that will slam onto your body, stick to you, and just burn you to a crisp. Like, just burn you alive, and you just scream and writhe around on the ground. And I love it. There is nothing better in my years of tabletop than bringing salamanders on the table and fighting against elves or Skaven and just being like, bleh, and you just kill like 30 of them with a single volley. It was so good. Salamanders, one of my favorite units by far in every version of the Lizardmen that was ever released by Games Workshop. They were such a great unit. So I'm super excited for them. They're fairly well armored. They have scaly skin. They're not like very tanky. They're not anything like Iron Drakes, for instance. But they're tanky enough. They have scaly skin, so they'll probably have a decent armor, maybe somewhere between like 30 to 60 armor. They'll probably have a little bit of missile resistance for scaly skin, though CA seems to be pretty wish-washy with applying scaly skin. Like, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the coolest thing about them is a fast-moving, mobile flamethrower that causes fear and is very, very strong in close combat. These critters were just as strong as Vargeis or Cryptors or anything else that's strength 5 that I can't think of off the top of my head. But, they hit really hard. They had a decent number of attacks, and they always have a bunch of skinks following them around, which are called skink handlers. Or some Lizardman players would call them prodders, because they would carry these little pointy sticks that are called prodders, and what their job is they literally run up behind the salamander and poke them in the butt or poke them in the side to make them super agitated, and then the salamander will like vomit out fire to kill everyone in front of them. Though sometimes it wouldn't always go super well, and the salamander would get mad at the skink in question and would bite their head off or turn and look at them and then breathe fire, so sometimes they would end up killing skinks. I would be surprised if they have the handlers in Total War Warhammer, because, for instance, like Hydras and Charybdis sometimes had handlers, sometimes didn't, depending on the edition. In the last edition, they didn't, even though handlers were like a core part of the Hydra model before that. So it's pretty up in the air to me if they're going to have handlers. I don't think they will, because like Rat Ogres for Skaven always had handlers in tabletop. You always had some Master Molders or Clan Molder handlers running around behind them, cracking whips and stuff. So that's not the case in Total War Warhammer. I don't think it's going to be the case in with the Lizardmen. So Salamanders, I'm just hoping it's a nice big bunch of sweet lizard boys who are just there to barf fire and ruin people's days. And it's going to be so nice having a really solid way to deal with mass infantry, especially mass cheap infantry that bunches up, without having to rely on Mazda Mundi or Slans using banishment. You know, it would be nice to instead have like a missile weapon that can do really, really well in that scenario. You know, where you hide your salamanders off to the side in the woods and wait for the perfect opportunity for them to scuttle out and get a perfect side shot and just melt everybody. I'm curious how they're going to do the damage, because they're kind of halfway between like what Iron Drakes do and what flame cannons do. They were basically flame cannons, but they weren't quite as strong, because, you know, they were mobile and were very, very scary in close combat. So we'll have to see. Their only big weakness in tabletop was that their leadership was kind of crap, because they were basically a skirmishing unit. You know, they were skirmishers that were very quick and would run out ahead of your army and start melting people. But if something went bad, the likelihood of them panicking and running away to rally later was very high. So we'll see if that's the case here. But that's it for Salamanders, so let's keep trucking. Alright, next up on our docket is the Engine of the Gods. So I've talked about this one a fair amount on stream, but for those unaware, we do not actually have all the versions of the Stegodons we're supposed to have. Granted, when the Engine of the Gods was first invented by Games Workshop, which was during the Lustria expansion, which, if you can't guess, focused on Tehenhauin as the main character versus Lord Nurglich, the very first leader of Clan Pestilence when they basically came into existence in Lustria. And it was about the 100-year war between the Skaven and the Cult of Sotek, or the Red Host as they're known. In any event, when it first was created, the Engine of the Gods actually was on like a Bronchiosaurus type dinosaur. So it was a dinosaur that had like a really long neck. But granted, it's Warhammer, so it still had really sharp teeth and had no problem munching on people. But it was this really stupid creature that was very large, and because of that was very tough, and it carried the Engine of the Gods on its back. And back then what it did is it was basically a long range, it was basically a catapult. It was the Lizardmen's first and only catapult. It would shoot these giant orbs of just flaming death that would go boom, and they go up, 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 over, and land in the middle of the Skaven army and just incinerate like 100 rats. And they were hilarious. And I'll have a picture of the Arcanodon up here. That's not what it's going to show up on, because that model was never actually released. That's actually a kit bash that Games Workshop did, and you had to like buy a magazine to figure out how to build this model. The model that I should show here is the current Engine of the Gods, which is mounted on a Stegodon, an ancient Stegodon. Only the oldest, most stubborn, chill Stegodons get to have an Engine of the Gods on their back, because it is a very, very, very crucial instrument to the Lizardmen, which you can tell by how heavy its name is. So let's talk about what it does. The Engine of the Gods, which could be taken as a regular unit, or it could be taken as a mount for Skink Priests, it was like their highest tier mount, it's this super powerful machine that the old ones left behind. And the Lizardmen don't understand how it works, but they understand how to turn it on. So it's kind of like, imagine if like a car was just dropped in your universe and you had no background, but you know, you understood that if I turn the key, the car turns on, and like I need to put gas in it, and if I hit the pedal, it goes. Like, you understand how to use the car, but if something happens to it, you're totally boned. That's basically the relationship the Lizardmen have with the Engine of the Gods. So what does it do? Well, it has three primary functions. The Engine of the Gods, first of all, has a bubble-like aura, and this bubble essentially protects all the Lizardmen within it. It gives all of them a big, nice, awesome ward save for just being near it, because it just kind of changes the way the world works and some other shenanigans to protect everyone in it. It's called the Portent of Warding, and it protects against missile fire, it protects against melee damage, it protects against everything within a short distance. Now, the way I see this one being interpreted is, quite frankly, I think it's just going to be like the Luminarch of Hysh, which, if you go play Total War Warhammer right now, the Luminarchs of Hysh have a local buff that provides, I think, like a 6% ward save, which isn't massive, but it's still really solid. You know, it makes it a nice buff wagon. Granted, I think on a Stegodon, it's going to be a lot more powerful than it was on a Chariot, which is mainly supposed to stay at range. But, you know, nonetheless. So, for Portent of Warding, I'm expecting just a small ward save, or a more likely option with CA's track record is it might just provide a more significant physical resistance save, maybe like 12% or 15%. Then it has something called Burning Alignment, which is basically that when the Engine of the Gods is rotated in a certain way, it starts firing off laser beams. And these laser beams just go out in all directions, and they completely don't harm the Lizardmen. They phase through the Lizardmen like regular light. But if they strike you and you are not a Lizardman, oh boy, you're in for a bad time. It basically will just melt your face. Like, Ark of the Covenant, you're dead. Like, it just evaporates you and lights you on fire. And it's this kind of pulse that goes out of light that everyone who's in range of it just takes flaming magical damage. Now, I'm not sure how they're going to have this work in Total War Warhammer, because it's similar to the Mortis engine, in that it's kind of a pulsing damage, but the Mortis engine was reinterpreted by Total War Warhammer to just do constant AoE damage that can't be interrupted and just happens. The Engine of the Gods traditionally had to activate the engine. It was a bound spell, essentially. It was something you physically had to be like, I'm going to do this, and your opponent had a chance to stop you with dispelling. Now, we don't have dispelling in the game as of right now in Total War Warhammer, which is something I'm going to make a video on very, very soon, but, you know, we'll stay on topic for now. And so for Burning Alignment, I see it being implemented one of two ways. Either A, it is like it's a ability that has an infinite number of activations, but you have to be in close combat to recharge it. That seems like the most fair way to properly interpret it. Where, you know, like you activate it and it goes boom and does a little damage, flaming magical damage around you, and then it has like a 30 to 60 second cooldown, depending on how much damage it does, right? In the area of effect. Or it could be like it has a number of casts and you just kind of click it every once in a while. I feel like the first one would be more fair and true to what the Engine of the Gods is supposed to do. Of course, they could make it like the Mortis engine, where it just does constant damage while it's in combat, but I feel like that would be too powerful and would not be a correct implementation. Like, the Mortis engine makes sense when it does that, because the whole point of the Mortis engine is it's like sucking the life out of everyone within range while pouring it into all the undead in range. You know, it's kind of like a reverse cycle of natural order. Whereas the Engine of the Gods is more like somebody smashing a button every couple of minutes that makes shit go boom. So I'm personally hoping for just like a localized small explosion that does really solid flaming magical damage, that has like a cooldown timer that's either in and out of melee. If it's out of melee, it should obviously be more substantial than if in melee. The last thing that it does is it has something essentially called Arcane Configuration. And in tabletop, this was a very, very simple ability, because it would literally be your magic phase would start and you would say, I'm going to make the Lore of Beasts easier to cast. And it would be like, okay, all the spells in Lore of Beasts are now cheaper to cast. I don't think they can do that in Total War Warhammer. I don't think there's a way to have it like just reduce, you know, to just click on it and it just makes your spells cheaper for a limited time. I don't think the system can handle that. So what I think it could do instead that would be really cool would be, imagine if Arcane Configuration was a active buff that would allow you to reduce the ability timers on a selected character. So imagine if like it was like a 60 second cooldown, and you would click Arcane Configuration and like click it on Mazdamundi and it reduced all his cooldowns by 15 seconds. Or you clicked it on Kroq-Gar to make, you know, the Hand of the Gods and all of his other abilities go up by 15 seconds. I think it should be it should be a small timer buff with a fairly long cooldown, because otherwise it could get super out of hand really quick. But I think that would be a really fair and fun way to implement it, because I can't see them having a version where you would click on it and it would make all your spells cheaper to cast, but then like stop doing that after a certain amount of seconds. I feel like that maybe that could be done, and if it could, that'd be really cool. But I feel like knowing CA, that's just not an option. So personally, I'm hoping for the ability recharge timer. Let me know what you guys think of that, or if you can think of something better. But I really like that idea. So that pretty much covers the Angel of the Gods. Like I said, it's one of those things that you'd be able to take separately or with a character, or a Skink Priest or Tehenhauin. So like imagine with like Norska, you can have the Chaos War Shrine and the Mammoth, but imagine if like the Shaman Sorcerer could take the Chaos War Shrine as his like top end mount, right? So hope that explains the situation well enough. And with that, let's go ahead and keep moving. So the next unit we're going to be looking at is another monstrous unit that I'm highly expecting, and I actually have a reason for this one. So the other ones I'm kind of expecting because they're units that are like super popular, have a really interesting dynamic they'd bring to the Lizardmen, and I don't think they'd be terribly hard to implement. You know, like the Stegodon, you've already done 90% of the work, and this one's very similar. It's a Bastiladon. But this is the Ark of Sotek, which is the last Bastiladon variant that exists. For those unaware, there were originally only two Bastiladons, which were the Solar Engine and the Ark of Sotek. Creative Assembly kind of came out and basically just reskinned the Solar Engine to give us the Revivification Crystal, which was super weird at the time and still is to me. But, you know, whatever, it works, and a lot of people like it. I like it. You know, it's cute, and it's a fun model, and it allows for some interesting play with Lizardmen. But the other true Bastiladon is the Ark of Sotek. And this one I feel really confident because I could find it if people really, really want to see it. But there was an interview early on during Warhammer 2. I think it was right after it came out, or it was right before it came out. I think it was before it came out. But there was an interview where people were talking about the Lizardmen roster. And one of the things that got brought up was that one of the devs said, like, he literally said, we are working on the Ark of Sotek, like, we're trying to get it into the game. Like, he literally took time to talk about the Ark of Sotek, despite the fact that it's a very difficult model. Because if you would ask me in a vacuum, hey, do you think they're going to do the Ark of Sotek? I would say no, because it's a complicated model. It's literally a Bastiladon that has this, well, you see a picture of it here on screen. It's got this kind of curvy thing on its back. It kind of looks like a pink ribbon from like breast cancer. You know, it looks like that ribbon symbol. But out of the two, actually there's 4 ends, not 2. But anyway, out of all those little holes come a like endless tide of snakes. It's kind of like there's this pit in the bottom of it that has a bunch of snakes in it that supposedly is bottomless, depending on what rumors you believe. And what the skinks do is they like superheat the bottom to make it very unpleasant for the snakes, which makes the snakes not only very, very angry because they're very hot and uncomfortable, but it forces them to come out, and they come pouring out of the holes, and they're so pissed that they just start biting at everything in range, which obviously the Bastiladon doesn't give two shits about because the Bastiladon's invincible to little snake bites. But all the people who are made out of fleshier bits, very unpleasant experience. So, in any event, granted, I don't think the snakes actually bite the Bastiladon typically because, you know, magic of Sotek, you know, just magic silliness. But in any event, this one is kind of a really interesting model because of the way I think it'll be implemented. So in tabletop, the Ark of Sotek was kind of it was a buff wagon that had this really crappy shooting attack that would go off every shooting phase. You'd walk it forward, and it had this very short range attack where it would hit all enemies around it, regardless if they were in combat or not. And it would do like poisoned shooting attacks to them. But they were super weak. So it usually only worked against units that have very, very low armor. But it wasn't that helpful, and a lot of people didn't take it. The only thing that it was really good for was that if you had jungle swarms nearby, you could activate the Ark of Sotek's true buff, which is that every turn he could basically just like out new swarms, like just right there on the ground. So like you'd have these swarm units that had like tons of wounds and were just sponges they were just damage sponges, and they could eat so many attacks, and they were super annoying, and your opponent would be like, yeah, I did 15 wounds, I'm finally gonna kill this swarm unit, and then Ark of Sotek would walk up and just be like, bleh, more snakes, and it would just make the unit keep growing. It was super obnoxious because it could take them above their starting size, and it was hilarious. But in any event, so I think what CA could do that would be really cool with the Ark of Sotek Bastiladon would be to do a halfway design between the jungle swarms and the Ark of Sotek, because they're not going to put swarms in the game. They've made that very clear. There are no swarms in the game, and all the swarms that are in the... Well, there are a lot of swarms in the game, but they've been cleverly put in the game. You know, the Tomb Kings have Tomb Swarms as an army ability that does damage in combat. The Vampire Coast has the Bat Swarms, who are a ability you can use on provinces to lower campaign movement, so on and so forth. So I could see Jungle Swarms maybe will be the right for Tehenhauin, which we'll talk about later, but for the Bastiladon, what I think they're going to do is, in Tabletop, the Jungle Swarms did provide an ability, which was that if they were in close combat with a unit, they provided all friendly units who were also in that combat poisoned attacks. So they gave poison attacks to friendly units. So I think that's what the Ark of Sotek will do. I think it'll be a big Bastiladon, you know, that's just as tanky as his friends, but he's designed to be in melee. And I think he's going to have poisoned attacks. You know, he has still those skinks on his back that throw javelins. And then I think he's just going to have a passive aura around him for like 30 meters that just gives poison to local enemies or local allies. I think it's either going to be that, or it will be an active that's on a very short cooldown that gives poison to like a unit or a group of units. But I think as a passive AoE buff for like 30 meters, that would be the best way to do it, because you would then have to bring the Bastiladon in really close. Like, he would have to be vulnerable fighting in the combat, and it would provide a local buff as opposed to like having him sit in the back and like you're just clicking on units like you do with Rev Crystals, you know, where you're trying to keep the Bastiladon safe and out of the fight, because providing localized poison is super strong. So, you know, that's a Bastiladon that should probably be forced to be involved in the fight. That way your opponent has a chance to counter it. But in any event, that's kind of what I'm expecting for him. Just a regular Bastiladon, just like all our other Bastiladons, but instead of being a long-range pew-pew laser or a medium-range heal wagon, I'm expecting a very, very close combat range poison buff wagon that provides a localized poison buff, which could be so strong on like Saurus Warriors, Temple Guard, or Kroxigors. You know, he's way too slow to keep up with Cav, but he's fast enough to keep up with Saurus. You just lumber his big old goofy ass in there, and he starts giving all your Saurus Warriors poison attacks, which could really help them in a lot of matchups. So those are my thoughts on the Ark of Sotek. We got one more unit to go in the likely to see section. The last unit we're going to be looking at are the Red-Crested Skinks. So these guys I put at the bottom of this list because I'm not super sold if they're going to be a unit or a Regiment of Renown. You know, it's kind of one of those toss-ups, because I would have said a Regiment of Renown, but then I look back at, say, King and the Warlord, when we got the Bugman's Rangers as a unit, despite the fact they were definitely what I would have considered Regiment of Renown material, just like I would say the same for Nasty Skulkers or Aspiring Champions, or a lot of those units that I would have never thought into making into separate units, but CA did, and it turned out really well, and I like a ton of those units, and I think they're super cool. Red-Crested Skinks to me kind of fall in that same category. So these guys aren't too complicated, and I'm not going to wax super lyrical on them. They have kind of two main neat tricks. So they're skink cohorts, which are the melee skinks. They could have javelins. I don't know if typically they came with javelins, but I could see them being either way, like hopefully both. That way if you wanted to pay extra for javelins, you could. But basically they're skinks who should just have better melee attack, better melee defense, period. The only other thing I could see giving them is that in single player, they would definitely have a bonus to dealing with Skaven, but I don't think there's a way to do that in multiplayer super well, because they have Hatred of Skaven, which lets them like reroll damage and stuff. The only other thing I could see them doing that would actually make them very competitive and very interesting in both single player and multiplayer is that in their original design through the Lustria campaign, which was in 6th edition through 7th edition, skink cohorts were immune to poison. But in 8th edition, I think Games Workshop was kind of like, that's a little overpowered for some regular skinks. And so they kind of just tweaked them into being, just having like Hatred Skaven. So I don't know if Red-Crested Skinks, I don't know if that would just be a banner for Tehenhauin that you could like equip onto certain skink units, or it would be like an army upgrade he would have exclusive access to that would make all his skinks red-crested. I hope they're a unit, because I think Red-Crested Skinks look really fucking cool. And I would love to see like a whole army of those skinks with those badass super big red crests. But if they were a regular unit, the only thing I would truly expect would be just them being like skink cohorts, but having better melee attack, melee defense. If CA wanted to go the distance and make them a little bit more expensive, but also super fucking strong, than give them immunity to poison, like I would like to see with Tehenhauin. If they could pull that off, then they would actually be a really high tier unit, I think, in certain matchups, because there are a lot of armies that actually rely pretty heavily on poison. You know, like Skaven and Warriors of Chaos to an extent, and maybe not a ton necessarily, but it would be kind of a neat option to have. In any event, that is going to do it for the units that I'm legitimately expecting. So now we're going to step into the section of units that I'm not really expecting, but there's a chance we'll see them, so I'm going to go ahead and cover them for your enjoyment and for the sake of the conversation. So let's get into that. Hey everyone, so as I was preparing this video for upload, I realized that it's already an hour long at this point, and we're only like halfway done. So I'm going to go ahead and break this video into two parts. The next part will focus on the units that I think are less likely to be in the DLC, along with some rights, comments, single player campaign, and regiments for renown. So that video will be up first thing tomorrow morning. That way you can catch it early. I hope you guys enjoyed part 1. Part 2 will be out tomorrow. I'm already rendering it. It's going to be too long. So I'm going to go ahead and separate them into two parts. I won't do that with like Legendary Lord videos because I'm totally cool with those being super long, but this is getting a little much. So I'll catch you guys for the second part tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed the first part. Thanks for watching.